Κυρίες και κύριοι, χαίρετε. Είναι η εκπομπή Γεωπολιτικά, μια εκπομπή που παρουσιάζει με έναν συνοπτικό τρόπο τα κυριότερα, τις κυριότερες γεωπολιτικές εξελίξεις στην περιοχή μας, αλλά και σε ολόκληρο τον κόσμο. Η σημερινή μας εκπομπή έχει μια ιδιαιτερότητα. Έχουμε την χαρά και την τιμή να φιλοξενούμε στα στούντιο της τηλεόρασης της Ναυτεμπορικής έναν πολύ σημαντικό γεωπολιτικό αναλυτή, η έδρα του οποίου είναι η Ουάσιγκτον. Η χαρά μας είναι διπλή, γιατί ο άνθρωπος αυτός είναι ελληνικής καταγωγής. Πρόκειται για τον Ιωάννη Συτιλίδη, ο οποίος βρίσκεται για λίγες μέρες στην Αθήνα και κατορθώσαμε να κλέψουμε μερικές ώρες από το χρόνο του για να τον έχουμε μαζί μας. Κύριε Συτιλίδη, καλώς ήρθατε στα στούντιο της τηλεόρασης της Ναυτεμπορικής. Πριν αναπτύξουμε τα θέματα που θα θίξουμε στην σημερινή μας εκπομπή, θα παρακαλούσα να μας πείτε με λίγα λόγια από πού κατάγεστε, την καταγωγή σας και με τι ασχολείστε στις ΗΠΑ.
Ευχαριστώ, κύριε Καλεντερίδη. Θα κάνω εγώ την προσπάθεια με τα σπαστά μου τα ελληνικά. Θα με συγχωρέσετε εδώ, λιγάκι μερικά λάθη εδώ που εκφράζομαι. Είμαι Πόντιος, καταγωγής σε ένα πολύ όμορφο χωριό της Αγίας Κυριακής, σε νομό Καστοριά, του πατέρα μου την οικογένεια και της μητέρας μου από ένα πολύ ωραίο χωριό η Πεπονιά, σε νομό Κοζάνη. Είμαστε Πόντιοι, είμαστε Μακεδόνες, είμαστε Έλληνες και εγώ είμαι Νέα Υορκέζος, ο πρώτος Αμερικανός γεννημένος σε όλο μου το σόι. Και έχω εγώ γραφείο στην Ουάσιγκτον, μένω στην πολιτεία την διπλανή, την Βιρτζίνια, με τη σύζυγο και 4 γιους. Και ασχολούμαι εγώ με γεωπολιτικά θέματα. Συμβουλεύω εγώ από τις μεγαλύτερες και πιο σημαντικές εταιρείες στις ΗΠΑ για γεωπολιτικούς κινδύνους γύρω τον κόσμο. Και βεβαίως έχουμε και ένα γραφείο που προστατεύει τα δικαιώματα των επιχειρημάτων στην Ουάσιγκτον όταν, ας πούμε, οι γραφειοκράτες μας παρακάνουν με...
Των επιχειρήσεων.
Ακριβώς, ναι. Ακριβώς, ναι. Ναι. Και έτσι είχα και αυτή την ευκαιρία να έρθω εδώ στην Ελλάδα αυτή την εβδομάδα, βεβαίως μετά τις εκλογές, και να μάθουμε ποια είναι η κατάσταση εδώ στην Ελλάδα, στην περιοχή και πώς μπορούμε εμείς σαν Αμερικανοί πολίτες να βοηθήσουμε και να δυναμώσουμε σχέσεις μεταξύ ΗΠΑ και Ελλάδα.
Μάλιστα. Το πρώτο θέμα που θα ήθελα να συζητήσουμε, θα ζητήσουμε την άποψή σας και τις γνώσεις σας, είναι οι σχέσεις των ΗΠΑ με την Κίνα. Γιατί παρότι αυτή τη στιγμή η ένταση και ο πόλεμος είναι σε εξέλιξη στην Ουκρανία, το κύριο ζήτημα για τις ΗΠΑ είναι οι σχέσεις της με την Κίνα. Και μάλιστα αυτό αποδεικνύεται από την επίσκεψη του κυρίου Μπλίνκεν πριν από λίγες εβδομάδες και πριν από λίγες ημέρες με την επίσκεψη της Υπουργού Οικονομικών της κυρία Γελέν στο Πεκίνο, μάλιστα μια τριήμερη επίσκεψη με πολύ σημαντικές επαφές. Πού βρίσκονται οι σχέσεις των ΗΠΑ με την Κίνα, προς τι αυτές τις επισκέψεις και πού πιστεύετε ότι θα καταλήξει το ζήτημα της Ταϊβάν?
Θα με επιτρέψετε από εδώ να σας απαντήσω στα αγγλικά για λόγους ευκολίας. Σας παρακαλώ. Ευχαριστώ πολύ. The US-China relationship is going to be the most important strategic relationship in the world in the entire 21st century. Even with the war in Russia and the horrible invasion of Ukraine and the suffering of the Ukrainian people, the larger issue is going to be how will the global economy adapt to the competition between the United States and China? This is playing out in terms of trade, in terms of technology, and potentially, and we hope not, but potentially, if China makes the wrong moves, a war over Taiwan, which will affect the global economy. And so we are working very hard to see where we can cooperate with China on the issues that are important for both countries and for the global economy and for global peace. But the Chinese Communist Party has undertaken an extraordinarily aggressive approach towards almost every one of its neighbors on the Asian continent and against the Western advanced industrial economies to steal our technology, to build up their own economy. And Sávvas, I say to you, when a country is building up a massive steel manufacturing process like nothing the world has ever seen, when it is importing food and energy for storage for years to come, and when it is developing maybe the world's largest navy, its means are probably not peaceful. its aims are to be aggressive and to be able, as they say openly in their speeches, to compete with the United States and to have a world-class military by 2049, which is the 100th anniversary of the takeover of the Chinese government by the Communist Party. So we have to manage this relationship very, very carefully in order to ensure that the rules-based order, of which Greece, many European countries, the United States, and almost the entire world has benefited from Chinese threats and domination potentially by 2049 in ways that I think will lead us to a very, very dark second half of the 21st century.
Yes. Κύριε Συτιλίδη, για να φτάσουμε όμως σε αυτή την κατάσταση, κάποιος έδωσε τη δυνατότητα στην Κίνα, όπως είπατε, να κλέψει την τεχνολογία. Και είδαμε ότι το τελευταίο διάστημα, για να εξισορροπήσει την κατάσταση η Ουάσιγκτον, στρέφεται προς την Ινδία, που είναι μια κίνηση. Η Ινδία είναι μια χώρα που έχει ομοιότητες με την Κίνα, είναι πιο δημοκρατική, δεν διοικείται από ένα κομμουνιστικό κόμμα όπως στην Κίνα, είναι πιο δημοκρατική, είναι μια μεγάλη χώρα, έχει μεγάλη έφεση στις τεχνολογίες ο Ινδικός λαός και στα μαθηματικά και στην υψηλή τεχνολογία. Προφανώς εκεί οι Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες Αμερικής θα βρουν ένα αντίβαρο. Πόσο πιθανόν είναι να γίνει ένα δεύτερο λάθος με την Ινδία, όπως κατά την άποψή μου έγινε κάποιο λάθος και στη σχέση με την Κίνα, για να μετατραπεί η Κίνα από μια χώρα με φτωχή τεχνολογία, τώρα να είναι πλούσια σε τεχνολογία και να ανταγωνίζεται και να απειλεί όχι μόνο τα οικονομικά συμφέροντα των ΗΠΑ, αλλά και την εθνική ασφάλεια των ΗΠΑ με αυτήν την υψηλή τεχνολογία που διαθέτει. Τι σημαίνει λοιπόν το άνοιγμα των Ηνωμένων Πολιτειών προς την Ινδία κατά την άποψή σας?
Πολύ σοβαρή ερώτηση αυτή, κύριε Σάββα. Let me say first of all that one of the greatest strategic errors on the part of United States foreign policy has been the deliberate uplifting of China, our number one potential threat, going back to the 1980s and 1990s, to become a competitor of the United States. And it's difficult to find any time in recent human or diplomatic history a time when the greatest power in the world facilitated the rise of its greatest adversary, which is what we've done in the United States, especially since 2001, when the United States welcomed China into the World Trade Organization, and then China began to engage in intellectual property theft, in sabotage, in coerced technology transfers, and a whole host of measures, so that to this day, the FBI director in Washington has testified in Congress that China is stealing about $600 billion worth of intellectual property from the United States every year. So we have to face up to our own errors in the United States, in Washington, and this is bipartisan, Republican and Democratic, from the Clinton administrations to the current administration. So when it comes to India, you raise a very important distinction here, Kirisav, and I want to emphasize this. And that is that India is the world's largest democracy. And it's not, I would say, that it's more democratic than China. China has zero democracy. There is no democracy. It's a dictatorship of the Communist Party. Remember, there's a genocide taking place in Western China. There are 2 million people in concentration camps. We haven't spoken about a phenomenon like this since the Holocaust of World War II. So the human rights abuses in China are monstrous, and they're disgusting to humanity. India is an imperfect democracy, but it's a democracy. And so when the Chinese government comes to the Greek people and says, we have our shared ancient civilizational values, that's a lie. They're not just ancient. One is democratic, Greece, and the other one is totalitarian and dictatorial, China.
Yes.
And India is democratic. It is in the family of democratic nations, however far they have to go to improve their democracy, because there are terrible, terrible human rights abuses in India as well. But you raise a very important point, Mr. Savvas, and that is that India is not going to ever become a junior partner of the United States, or an ally of the United States. It is a great civilization itself, dating back 4,000 years. It now has a greater population than that of China. It does have very serious disputes with China, which China has been exacerbating in recent years. The question, I think, is really, what does India see as being in its interests in dealing with China? How does India work better with countries in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, and then in this new framework with the United States, with Japan, and with Australia to try to balance China's very aggressive activities in the Indo-Pacific region? So I think we have a good foundation for a stronger U.S.-India partnership, but there'll be many areas where we disagree. For instance, India continues to buy major armaments from Russia, like the S-400 system, and the Biden administration will likely not sanction India, even though it has imposed sanctions on Turkey. Very important distinction. On the other hand, India is buying enormous amounts of oil and natural gas from Russia, despite U.S. and EU efforts to try to persuade India to no longer purchase that and further punish Russia's economy. And India has very good relations with Iran, which may become one of the most difficult challenges in the next several years, and so is not really assisting the U.S. in that regard. So it'll adopt a very independent foreign policy where India's government feels that's how it advances its interests, and where it works with the United States to advance common interests, it will do so. It's going to be a very challenging issue, but it's not going to be, quote unquote, following America's commands. That's not India, nor will it be anytime in the near future.
Πριν από λίγες ημέρες είχαμε τη Σύνοδο Κορυφής στο Βίλνιους της Λιθουανίας. Η Λιθουανία είναι μια χώρα, μια βαλτική χώρα, από τις τελευταίες που μπήκαν στην περιοχή στο ΝΑΤΟ, αδύναμες χώρες και οι τρεις χώρες της Βαλτικής, με ισχυρή ρωσική μειονότητα, στη Λετωνία και στην Εστονία αγγίζει το 30%, χωρίς δικές τους δυνατότητες να αμυνθούν. Άρα το ΝΑΤΟ είναι μια καταφυγή για αυτές τις χώρες. Εκεί λοιπόν είχαμε μια πολύ σημαντική Σύνοδο Κορυφής. Και θεωρείται σημαντική κατά την άποψή μου επειδή με την είσοδο, με την ένταξη της Φινλανδίας και της Σουηδίας το ΝΑΤΟ αποκτά δύο πλεονεκτήματα. Το ένα είναι ότι μετατρέπεται η Βαλτική θάλασσα σε μια ανατοϊκή λίμνη και ισχυροποιείται το ΝΑΤΟ στην Αρκτική, μια περιοχή που θα τη δούμε τον 21ο αιώνα ίσως και να πρωταγωνιστεί όσον αφορά το γεωπολιτικό ανταγωνισμό. Εκεί λοιπόν στην Σύνοδο Κορυφής του Βίλνιους, που μπορούμε να τη χαρακτηρίσουμε ιστορική, είχαμε και την έγκριση των νέων επιχειρησιακών σχεδίων του ΝΑΤΟ με δεδομένες τις νέες απειλές όπως αυτές διαμορφώνονται από τον πόλεμο στην Ουκρανία. Εκεί είδαμε την Τουρκία να προσπαθεί να εκβιάσει το ΝΑΤΟ, ενώ υπάρχει μια τόσο κρίσιμη σύνοδος και άνοιξε μια σειρά από θέματα. Καταρχάς, πώς κρίνετε εσείς από τη δική σας πλευρά αυτή τη Σύνοδο Κορυφής στο Βίλνιους, και το δεύτερο σκέλος του ερωτήματός μου είναι πώς είδαν οι Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες Αμερικής, όχι εσείς προσωπικά όπως το εισπράξατε στην Ουάσιγκτον, πώς είδαν αυτόν τον εκβιασμό από πλευράς της Τουρκίας?
You've raised a number of very important issues that have arisen leading up to, during, and after the NATO summit in Vilnius. First, let me just state, if I might, that Finland is in the NATO alliance. Sweden is not. So Mr. Erdogan seemed to indicate that Turkey would lift its veto of Sweden's accession. President Biden then offered President Erdogan, the press event, thanked him publicly before the entire world, and said, "Thank you, President Erdogan, for your leadership." All wonderful gifts to President Erdogan, especially for the voters that just brought him back into power. And then after the NATO summit was over, Erdogan said, well, we're not going to decide the Sweden issue until October. So he gave Sweden and then took half of it back. Brilliant diplomacy by Erdogan, very crafty, very cunning, and President Biden and the NATO leaders should have done a more secure job of confirming that Turkey will not block Sweden's accession. I hope it takes place, but I'm not sure. We don't know today, and it's only July. So this is an example of the kind of manipulation of the NATO alliance that I think Erdogan has been very successful at. He secured a number of objectives, especially regarding quote-unquote Kurdish terrorism that's being supported by Sweden, and a number of other issues that are very important for Erdogan, and put himself in the middle of world leadership in a way that far transcends his actual stature inside of Turkey. On a larger scale, I don't know if this will be seen as a historic summit as much as one that is very uncertain in its objectives, because, and we saw this with the response of Western leaders to Ukrainian President Zelensky's very angry responses to the denial of any immediate membership in NATO. First of all, Ukraine is in no position to join the NATO alliance today or anytime in the near future. That is more of a very hopeful political message. But Ukraine doesn't come anywhere near meeting the standards of being able to join the NATO alliance. And as President Biden has correctly said, if Ukraine were to join NATO tomorrow or in 6 months, that means that NATO is at war with Russia. And NATO is in no position to go to war with Russia, nor, I believe, does Russia want to go to war with NATO. Russia wants Ukraine to be neutral. And so when you had the Baltic countries that came into the NATO alliance, that was not seen as a strategic threat to Moscow or to Russia's nuclear deterrent. But Ukraine has been a red line issue for Russia for 20 years. And even the current CIA director, William Burns, when he was ambassador to Moscow in 2008, about 15 years ago, he wrote to the administration in Washington, this is a red line not just for Putin, but all of the oligarchs, all of the elite, and all of the Russian people. And I'm afraid that we did not take Putin's threats very seriously. And now we have a catastrophe, the destruction of Ukraine's economy. About a quarter of its population is now refugees. It will cost $250 billion, maybe $500 billion, to rebuild Ukraine. And it's been completely destroyed as a functioning nation state. And I don't see how it is able to gain back Crimea or eastern Ukraine. So we have to be very serious about what kind of promises and offers of assistance the U.S. and NATO can provide to Ukraine. And to your last point, yes, the Arctic Ocean is going to become probably the next strategic theater of competition, not only between Russia and the West, but also China, which sees the opportunity to speed up shipping from its ports in the East Asian Sea to Northern European ports about 1/3 faster than right now going through the South China Sea, the Indian Ocean, the Suez Canal, and the Mediterranean. So I think you're going to see a strategic competition in the decades ahead, especially if the waters remain warmer in the Arctic between the West, Russia, and China in ways that most analysts have not really detected to this day.
Κύριε Συτιλίδη, αυτός ο πόλεμος στην Ουκρανία δεν ξεκίνησε μια μέρα έτσι ξαφνικά. Η κρίση ξεκίνησε το 2008 στο Βουκουρέστι με την απόφαση του ΝΑΤΟ καταρχάς να δηλώσει ότι θέλει να εντάξει στη συμμαχία την Ουκρανία και την Γεωργία, και στη συνέχεια είχαμε τα γεγονότα του Μεϊντάν του 2014, τις συμφωνίες του Μίνσκ, την παραβίαση των συμφωνιών του Μίνσκ και τελικώς ο πόλεμος. Από τη στιγμή που έχουμε την υπογραφή της συμφωνίας Όκους, Αυστραλία, Ηνωμένο Βασίλειο και Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες Αμερικής, που αυτό δείχνει ότι η στρατηγική προτεραιότητα των ΗΠΑ είναι εκεί, Ινδικός, Ειρηνικός ωκεανός, Κίνα. Πόσο έξυπνο είναι να ξεσπάσει ένας πόλεμος στην Ουκρανία, να πάρουμε τη Ρωσία ως εχθρό και να την αναγκάσουμε να πέσει στην αγκαλιά της Κίνας. Δηλαδή, αν αύριο αναγκαστούν οι ΗΠΑ να αντιμετωπίσουν την Κίνα, δεν θα είναι από χειρότερη θέση οι ΗΠΑ να την αντιμετωπίσουν όταν θα έχει δίπλα της τη Ρωσία? Γιατί μπορεί η Ρωσία να έχει πολλές αδυναμίες, όμως γνωρίζετε ότι στον τομέα της αεροδιαστημικής και στην πυραυλική τεχνολογία είναι πολύ μπροστά, πιο μπροστά από την Κίνα, και ίσως είναι πολύ κοντά στις ΗΠΑ. Αυτό, αν έχουμε κάποια στιγμή μια μεγάλη σύγκρουση ή κρίση με την Κίνα, θα ισχυροποιήσει την πλευρά της Κίνας και θα αποδυναμώσει τις ΗΠΑ. Τι λογαριασμός έγινε, πιστεύετε, στα μυαλά αυτών που χαράσουν τη στρατηγική στην Ουάσιγκτον? Δεν βγαίνει αυτή η εξίσωση, οδηγεί στο άπειρο.
So let's just be clear from the outset here, Sávva, that there are no geniuses that are able to solve all of the many challenges that we face around the world. And the U.S. does have the great responsibility of, I would say very frankly, leading the West. our European allies, our democratic allies in Asia, and they see us as a leader, but we don't have every answer immediately available. There are great challenges ahead, and there are no perfect solutions. There are simply trade-offs. So going back to the Obama administration, the U.S. foreign policy establishment has recognized that with the rise of China as a belligerent and aggressive and potentially hostile adversary in Asia, we need to really shift much of our focus away from counterterrorism, right, after Afghanistan and Iraq, towards the rise of China. But our European alliance is very, very important to the United States. And as we see now, there are still crises that emerge in Europe. So I don't think we can have a 100% pivot to one part of the world and abandon the other. The question is, how do we balance what needs to be a greater distribution of forces and resources and assets to the Indo-Pacific region while maintaining the security umbrella for our European allies? And that's going to be the great challenge for many years to come. And we have a very healthy debate about this in Washington right now. There are some who say that we should leave Europe to defend itself. The European Union has a great amount of wealth. It is simply not devoting the resources necessary to defense that, say, the U.S. is. And Presidents Obama and President Trump and President Biden have all complained to many European countries at least the 2% threshold to provide a serious defense. If you want the United States to defend you, are you becoming colonies of the United States? Or can Europe ever certainly and securely defend itself? That's going to be a great issue. But by the same token, we do have to move forces and assets and resources to the Indo-Pacific, because I think the goal here, Savvas, is to deter and dissuade China from invading Taiwan, from possibly challenging Japan, from taking over the entire South China Sea and threatening free and open shipping lanes and international law in the South China Sea, or maybe even triggering another war with India, which would be calamitous for the Asian continent. So this is going to be a very serious challenge, and my fear is that, as you correctly note, we need to find ways, it won't be anytime soon because we've destroyed our relationship, our potential relationship with Moscow for the near term. But perhaps in a post-Putin environment, and I'm not confident we're not going to have somebody who's a more difficult leader than Putin, a butcher perhaps, not a Belgian diplomat. I mean, we think that it's going to be better after Putin. Why? History shows that these are tough leaders in Russia always. But maybe the greatest violation of great power balance in geopolitics is to ensure that Russia and China are never closer to each other than they are to the United States. And we're violating it right now with your comment, accurately, that we're pushing Russia into China's embrace, and China will hold on to Russia as tightly as it can. Cheap oil, cheap gas, cheap coal, cheap food, cheap fertilizers, all the things that China needs to import, and that it can try to set up a separate supply line away from dependence on the U.S. So I'm concerned that we're thinking very short term, but we're not thinking long term, and that we may regret in 2030 or 2035 or 2040, for the sake of the Ukraine war, surrendering Russia into partnership with China that will be enormously damaging to Western interests.
Θα κάνουμε ένα μικρό διάλειμμα, κύριε Συτιλίδη. Κυρίες και κύριοι, θα κάνουμε ένα μικρό διάλειμμα λίγων λεπτών και σε λίγο θα είμαστε και πάλι μαζί. Μείνετε μαζί μας. Και πάλι μαζί, είμαστε στο δεύτερο μέρος της εκπομπής Γεωπολιτικά. Να το ξαναπούμε για όσους δεν ήταν στην αρχή της εκπομπής. Έχουμε τη χαρά και την τιμή να φιλοξενούμε στην εκπομπή μας τον γεωπολιτικό αναλυτή, τον κύριο Ιωάννη Συτιλίδη, ο οποίος γεννήθηκε στις ΗΠΑ και δραστηριοποιείται εκεί. Είμαστε στο δεύτερο μέρος της εκπομπής και συνεχίζουμε τις ερωτήσεις μας στον κύριο Συτιλίδη. Κύριε Συτιλίδη, να πάμε στα δύσκολα. Στα δύσκολα όχι για εσάς, κυρίως για εμάς εδώ στην Ευρώπη. Ένας πόλεμος είναι σε εξέλιξη. Ένας μεγάλος πόλεμος μεγάλης κλίμακας, με ένα μέτωπο 1.000 χιλιόμετρων. Από τη μια πλευρά είναι μια χώρα μόνη της και αδύναμη, η Ουκρανία, και από την άλλη είναι μια χώρα που έχει 7.000 πυρηνικές κεφαλές. Και σύμφωνα με το δόγμα, που μάλιστα το επανέλαβε πριν από λίγες μέρες ο κύριος Λαυρόφ, είπε ότι σε 2 περιπτώσεις θα κάνουμε χρήση των πυρηνικών όπλων. Η πρώτη είναι αν δεχθούμε πυρηνική επίθεση. Η δεύτερη, εάν θεωρήσουμε ότι κινδυνεύει η Ρωσία, ότι έχει ζωτική απειλή. Κάτι το οποίο δεν είναι μετρήσιμο. Η πυρηνική επίθεση είναι μετρήσιμη. Τη βλέπεις και απαντάς. Η ζωτική απειλή τη χαρακτηρίζεις εσύ. Δηλαδή μπορεί αύριο, εάν κινδυνεύει να υποστεί μια ήττα η Ρωσία, να πει είναι ζωτική απειλή και κάνω χρήση πυρηνικών όπλων. Εδώ λοιπόν αυτό το ζήτημα θα ήθελα αν γνωρίζετε, απασχολεί τις ΗΠΑ μια ενδεχόμενη πυρηνική χρήση πυρηνικού όπλου και πού θα οδηγήσει αυτό. Και εν πάση περιπτώσει, τι πιστεύετε, πότε πιθανολογείται, γιατί κανείς δεν γνωρίζει, ότι μπορεί να τελειώσει αυτός ο πόλεμος?
The first question that you asked, Savvas, is one of the most important ones that any leader can ask and seek to answer as correctly as possible, because if we're talking about a nuclear threat, there's probably no graver danger to, I won't say humanity, we're not talking about a world war exchange of nuclear weapons, but even if we have the use of a low-yield 5-kiloton weapon in the Black Sea or in an open battlefield of Ukraine, we're talking about not just massive devastation, potentially, of human beings and of property, but also such a shock to the international system that could have reverberations for the global economy for many years to come. Now, when Russia, and I will say correctly, re-invaded Ukraine in February of last year, because it invaded in 2014.
Yes.
So it re-invaded in 2022, just to be accurate.
Το 2014 το έκανε με αντιπροσώπους, εννοώ με τους κατοίκους της Ουκρανίας που ελέγχονται από τη Ρωσία, ενώ τώρα το έκανε φανερά με το δικό της στρατό.
Yes, indirectly and now directly.
Yes.
One of the first things that President Biden, I think wisely, was concerned about was to ensure that we don't engage in the kind of armament of Ukraine that Russia will perceive, or more accurately misperceive, as an escalating threat that could be existential to Russia's existence, per your question. What's interesting, though, is over the last 16 months, because I think most people would never have believed, first of all, that Russia would conduct this size and scope of an armored invasion of a modern European country in 2022, but that the war would go on now for 16 months. And this war could go on for another year, 2 years, 3 years. I mean, this is a war of attrition. We don't see any massive movement of forces. It looks right now like Russia is waiting for Ukraine to exhaust itself. Ukraine's probably lost 300 to 350,000 soldiers. It's out of artillery shells. It's out of rockets. The United States is running out of artillery shells to provide to Ukraine. Europe is essentially incapable of providing any serious armaments to Ukraine. And then when Ukraine has exhausted itself after this unfortunately failed counteroffensive, we may see Russia strike again. They were miserable in February, March, and April of last year. But now I think Putin has remobilized forces in a way that they may move on Odessa, they may move on Kharkiv and seal off all of Ukraine's borders with Russia, so that Russia has control of what is today in Ukraine, all the way from Romania and Moldova, starting with Odessa, the entire Black Sea coastline, and all around up to Belarus, so that Ukraine is completely cut off from Russia. And then Russia may say, okay, now we're ready for peace talks. So we don't know where this will go. The problem that we have now is that, as President Biden, as I mentioned earlier, said, we need to be careful that we don't accidentally escalate and have an exchange of nuclear weapons. Over the last 16 months, because almost nobody expected the war to go on this long, we said first, no tanks, then we're providing tanks. We said no F-16s, and now NATO countries are providing F-16s. Then we said no long-range missiles that Ukraine can use to strike into Crimea or into Russian territory, and now ATACMS and maybe HIMARS are coming to Ukraine. And we don't know what, like you said accurately, what constitutes an existential threat to Russia. But most analysts believe if there is a serious military assault by Ukraine, backed up by the United States and NATO, against Crimea, that may be the tripwire. So we have to be very careful over here that we are providing whatever support we're providing for Ukraine without giving Russia the sense that it's justified in detonating a nuclear weapon in ways that would be utterly shocking to the international community.
Τώρα θα πάμε στη δύσκολη ερώτηση. Βγάζω το καπέλο του Έλληνα, γίνομαι πολίτης του κόσμου και βλέπω δύο περιπτώσεις. Τη μία περίπτωση είναι η Κύπρος και η άλλη είναι η Ουκρανία. Στην Κύπρο μία χώρα, η Τουρκία, επικαλείται την ασφάλεια των ομοεθνών της, των Τουρκοκυπρίων, κάνει μία εισβολή, τη βοήθησαν και οι μεγάλες χώρες, αυτά να μην τα ξεχνάμε, και καταλαμβάνει το 37% μιας χώρας που ανήκει στον Οργανισμό Ηνωμένων Εθνών και από το 2000, στις αρχές του 2000 και στην Ευρωπαϊκή Ένωση. Και συνεχίζει εκεί να κατέχει αυτό το τμήμα, κυρίως με αμερικάνικα όπλα. Μετά από 48 χρόνια, ένας άλλος ηγέτης μιας άλλης χώρας, τότε το έκανε ο Τσεβίτ, για ακριβώς τους ίδιους λόγους, για να προστατέψει, λέει, τους Ρώσους, εισβάλλει σε μια άλλη χώρα και καταλαμβάνει το 20%, όχι το 37%. Εκεί όμως η διεθνής κοινότητα είναι με τον αμυνόμενο, με την Ουκρανία, και στέλνει όπλα, πυρομαχικά, πολιτική στήριξη, οικονομική στήριξη. Την ίδια στιγμή η Κύπρος παραμένει υποκατοχή και όχι μόνο δεν στηρίζουν την Κύπρο με τον ίδιο τρόπο για να εκδιώξει αυτούς που έχουν εισβάλει, δίνουν όπλα σε αυτόν που τον εισβολέα. Οι ΗΠΑ είχαν κάνει και εμπάργο στην Κύπρο. Πέρσι ευτυχώς το εμπάργο τελείωσε. Εδώ λοιπόν, επαναλαμβάνω, δεν το βλέπω σαν Έλληνα, σαν πολίτης του κόσμου. Εδώ υπάρχει μια πολιτική δύο μέτρων και δύο σταθμών. Άλλα κάνουμε στην Ουκρανία, άλλα κάνουμε στην Κύπρο. Πώς ερμηνεύεται αυτό από έναν πολίτη του κόσμου όπως εσάς? Εγώ έβγαλα το καπέλο μου σαν Έλληνας, δεν μίλησα σαν Έλληνας τώρα.
Και εγώ φορώ το καπέλο μου σαν Αμερικανός. Ναι. Okay? In many ways, one can look at the historical parallels between the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. And we would say, going back to the beginning of last year, that Turkey wrote the playbook for how to invade another country for the ostensible reason of protecting your ethnic minority and eating away at its territory and then occupying it illegally in defiance of international law and essentially getting away with it. And you're correct, it started on the 48th anniversary. We're about to commemorate the 49th anniversary of the invasion of Cyprus. And next year, unfortunately, probably it'll still remain in place. I mean, hopefully there's a diplomatic initiative, but we will likely be forced to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the invasion and occupation of Cyprus. But without delving too deeply into history, Savas, and you know the history, I do, and I'm sure your well-informed audience does as well, there was a very different context for all of this because Cyprus, unfortunately, was caught up in the vortex of the Cold War between NATO and the United States and the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. Turkey had the longest land border with the Soviet Union of any country in the NATO alliance. Almost all of American foreign policy for several decades, and Cyprus was merely one victim of many of the Cold War, was played out in that context. So the most important issue was to make sure that the Soviet Union did not take any leadership exploitation of any particular crisis in any particular part of the world. And what was important then was initially, Cyprus was seen as a very, very important issue in the State Department under Henry Kissinger, until Kissinger several days later, and there were several declassified documents in Washington that I will just share with you now, will likely be published in the next 6 months or so, that shed tremendous light on Kissinger and the State Department's own decision-making in 1974. But they made a calculation that the pressure on Turkey that would be required to remove forces was too great at a time when the U.S. was dependent on Turkey to bottle off the Black Sea and the Soviet Navy through the Straits, the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, and to maintain that very lengthy and very well-armed border with the Soviet Union near the Caucasus. And so that was the trade-off. And unfortunately, Cyprus lost its independence and its sovereignty, especially in the northern third, for the sake of the Cold War. Whereas what you have now, it's almost a complete reversal. You have sort of this almost maniacal loathing of Vladimir Putin, and we've taken a very complicated issue between Russia and Ukraine that Vladimir Putin warned the West before the 2008 NATO summit. At the 2007 Munich Security Conference, he gave a speech, and he said, this is a red line for us. And this cannot become part of NATO. And the next year, the Bush administration said Ukraine and Georgia will become part of NATO. And don't forget, yes, Russia invaded Georgia in 2008, and the West did essentially nothing. Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 and annexed Crimea, and there were some sanctions. But what did President Obama say? He said at that time that Ukraine is not worth war with Russia. Now, what's interesting is it wasn't then, but it is today. And I think this is what has many people in Washington concerned about, as we were answering your earlier question. How far will the U.S. go in arming Ukraine? How long will this war go? What does it mean when the West says we will support Ukraine for as long as it takes? Τι είναι αυτό το it, αυτό το αυτό, right? We don't know. There's no mission statement in Washington, D.C. There's no serious debate in Washington, D.C. But what we do know is that what will likely happen in Ukraine is it will likely wind up as a frozen conflict, as Cyprus has suffered over the last 49 years. And my fear is, because we didn't take Putin's threat seriously enough, 20%, 25%, 30% of Ukraine is gone. 30% of its economy is gone. 25% of its population is gone. It will be left as a rump state. Mostly Catholic Western Ukraine will be left. And the remaining part will be illegally annexed by Russia, will not be recognized by the international community. Ukraine will become Cyprus times 100. And that's going to be the future of Ukraine for the foreseeable future. We should have learned our lesson in Cyprus. We did not. And it's not just Cyprus, Sávva. I would also say Kosovo. The Kosovo example is one that Vladimir Putin has never forgotten. And from his perspective, when the West thought it was appropriate to take territory away from a sovereign country, Serbia, and give it to a country whose military forces 2 years earlier were considered terrorists by the United States government, the KLA. And 2 years later, they had their own government on sovereign Kosovo territory. So it's Cyprus, then Kosovo, and now Ukraine.
Υπάρχει και κάτι χειρότερο, κύριε Συτιλίδη. Όταν πήγαν στο Χίτλερ τα επιχειρησιακά σχέδια για την γενοκτονία των Εβραίων, ρώτησε στους επιτελείς του, μα τι θα πει ο κόσμος, τι θα πει η διεθνής κοινή γνώμη. Και του είπαν, γιατί ποιος θυμάται τους Αρμενίους που τους έκανε γενοκτονία η Τουρκία. Εδώ ακριβώς το ίδιο έγινε και με την Κύπρο. Ποιος θυμάται την Κύπρο, είπε ο Πούτιν, και εισέβαλε στην Ουκρανία. Εδώ λοιπόν τα πληρώνουμε τα λάθη που γίνονται στη διεθνή σκηνή με μεγαλύτερους πολέμους και πιο καταστροφικούς πολέμους, γιατί συμφωνώ με αυτό που λέτε. Πιστεύω ότι όχι οι επόμενοι, σε 2 επόμενες γενιές στην Ουκρανία θα πληρώνουν αυτόν τον πόλεμο. Δεν κλείνει εύκολα αυτή η πληγή. Τώρα υπάρχει ένα άλλο τεράστιο ζήτημα. Από αυτά που διαβάζουμε, προηγήθηκε πριν από τη Σύνοδο Κορυφής στο Βίλνιους τηλεφωνική συνομιλία του Τζέικ Σάλιβαν με τον ομόλογό του στην Άγκυρα, του κυρίου Μπλίνκεν με τον κύριο Φιντάν. Παρεμπιπτόντως, ο κύριος Φιντάν και ο κύριος Ερντογάν κατηγορούνται για παράνομες απαγωγές 220 πολιτών από ξένες χώρες. Η Ένωση Ευρωπαίων Δικαστών και Εισαγγελέων 20.000 μέλη έχει, Στο Διεθνές Ποινικό Δικαστήριο κατέθεσε ένα φάκελο με 4.000 σελίδες, με ντοκουμέντα, εμπλοκή του Ερντογάν και του Φιντάν σε παράνομες απαγωγές, βιασμούς ανθρώπων, βασανιστήρια και χάθηκαν κάποιοι άνθρωποι. Εν πάση περιπτώσει, ο κύριος Μπλίνκεν μίλησε με τον κύριο Φιντάν στο τηλέφωνο και στη συνέχεια ο κύριος Μπάιντεν με τον κύριο Ερντογάν. Ένα από τα θέματα που έθεσε ο κύριος Ερντογάν ήταν να πάψουν οι Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες της Αμερικής να συνεργάζονται με το YPG και με το PYD, με τους SDF, με τις δημοκρατικές δυνάμεις της Συρίας, στη Συρία. Και εκεί οι Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες της Αμερικής συνεργάζονται με τους Κούρδους και με τους Άραβες, με τις δημοκρατικές δυνάμεις της Συρίας, εναντίον του Ισλαμικού κράτους. Το οποίο Ισλαμικό κράτος το γνωρίζουν όλοι καλύτερα από όλους στην Ουάσιγκτον, ότι στηρίζεται και υποστηρίζεται ανοιχτά από την Τουρκία. Και το Ισλαμικό κράτος, το ISIS, είναι μια παγκοσμίως αναγνωρισμένη τρομοκρατική οργάνωση. Και ήρθε ο Ερντογάν να ζητήσει από τον Μπάιντεν να σταματήσει την συνεργασία με τις δυνάμεις που στρέφονται εναντίον μιας τρομοκρατικής οργάνωσης την οποία στηρίζει η Τουρκία. Πόσο λογικό δεν είναι σουρεαλιστικό όλο αυτό?
Savvas, welcome to the world of geopolitics. There are no easy answers. There are no straight lines. These are extraordinarily complex issues. And as I mentioned repeatedly, everything involves a trade-off. There are no perfect solutions. There are going to be good opportunities. There are going to be great and grave and dangerous risks. And it's always a matter of balancing. And how do we find some measure of what I would call equilibrium among competing interests and parties? Now, with Islamic State, I will say that even though it's quite well known that Erdogan's decisions facilitated the arrival of Islamic State terrorists 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when the Syrian civil war began, once that became a problem for Turkey, the borders somehow closed and they weren't allowing Islamic State terrorists to flow into Syria anymore. And just the way I would say the migration flows in 2015 into Europe through Turkey somehow magically stopped once there was a 6 billion euro deal with Erdogan. Obviously, the Turkish military and the Turkish police do control the flow of either human trafficking and criminal organizations that bring migrants and refugees into Greece and into Europe, and vice versa, bringing Islamic terrorists into Turkey, down into Syria and into Iraq. And yes, many, many human rights violations are in fact documented. And this is going to be an issue, I say, for more than anything else. I mean, I'll put Jake Sullivan and Washington out of this for now, because this is really going to become an important issue between Brussels and Ankara. And now, if it's in fact correct that there will be a potential reopening of Turkey's EU accession talks as a result of the Sweden deal, and again, we have to see if that's really a deal and if Sweden actually does get in with the Turkish parliament debate and vote in October. That's up to the European Union to decide in terms of how it's going to deal with these human rights violations. The problem that we have, Savvas, and this has been an ongoing Western problem with Turkey for many decades, is Turkey has for many decades seen itself as a European country, right? They're a member of NATO, they want to be a part of the European Union, and yet they don't comply with European standards of human dignity, of individual liberties, of the freedoms that we associate with being in the West. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech. These are the things that are important for us in the West. So we've always categorized Turkey as what we call in English a secular democracy. We never described Greece or France or Norway as a something democracy. They're simply democracies. But Turkey has always been a secular democracy because it's a Muslim population. It's an Islamic society. They have different standards. And the question for we in the West, here in Greece, back in Washington or elsewhere in Europe, is do we view Turkey through the prism of Europeanness and a Western identity? Or do we view Turkey as a country in a very dangerous part of the world, Muslim in religion and in society, that needs to be compared not with Greece and Belgium and Czechia, but with Iraq and Iran and Egypt and Pakistan? And that's the ongoing conundrum. And we have our own difficulties in Washington with this, But in terms of all of the many very serious challenges that Turkey faces that are documented in Brussels, that's going to be a European issue. But I will tell you one thing. The Biden administration has made very clear it wants to support Turkey as much as possible in this EU accession process. Of course, the White House wants to sell $20 billion worth of weapons to Turkey, and we're putting tremendous pressure on senators and congressmen to release their veto on that arms packaging. And by the same token, I think you'll see significant pressure by Washington on Brussels and on various European capitals to be as accommodating as possible within certain standards, of course, so that Turkey's EU accession process can continue even if it is never actually achieved, which it probably will never be.
Μας έμειναν 4 λεπτά, κύριε Συτιλίδη. Και αφήσαμε το καλύτερο για το τέλος, οι σχέσεις των ΗΠΑ με την Ελλάδα. Πώς τις βλέπετε να αναπτύσσονται τα τελευταία χρόνια, τι αέρα μας φέρνετε από την Ουάσιγκτον για τις ελληνοαμερικανικές σχέσεις?
Very straightforward, Sávva. U.S.-Greece relations are the best they have been in almost every dimension since, I don't know, 60, 70 years ago, maybe when Greece first joined the NATO alliance in the 1950s and early 1960s. The period that we're seeing right now is marked by military cooperation, by economic cooperation, by technology cooperation, by foreign direct investment. And of course, we see security and intelligence sharing between the United States and Greece at a level that we haven't seen in decades. And that's been bolstered not only by the recognition in Washington of what an important ally Greece really is for American and European security in this arc of crisis. I mean, look at the map. We have the war in Ukraine, we have foreign policy drift in Turkey, civil war in Syria, civil war in Libya. The only stable country that is both...
Κατοχή στην Κύπρο.
Κατοχή στην Κύπρο, ευχαριστώ πολύ. Ευτυχώς δεν σκοτώνεται κανείς εκεί σήμερα, αλλά πάλι κίνδυνος πάντα εκεί. The only stable ally that's both in NATO and the European Union is Greece. And now, with the hopeful opening of Alexandroupolis as a strategic asset of Greece, moving into the Western Balkans, moving into Central and Eastern Europe as a military, energy, transport, and logistics hub, Greece's value to the West is only strengthened and enhanced. And this will only redound to Greece's greater benefit in Washington and an even stronger partnership between Washington, Athens, and hopefully we can solve Cyprus and move it forward to bring Cyprus into this larger framework as well.
Τελευταία ερώτηση. Σε αυτήν οι συμμαχίες είναι δίνω και παίρνω. Τι πιστεύετε, μήπως η Ελλάδα έχει δώσει περισσότερα από όσα παίρνει, δηλαδή μήπως οι ΗΠΑ σε σχέση με την τεράστια σημασία της βάσης της Σούδας και της Αλεξανδρούπολης και της Λάρισσας, μήπως οι ΗΠΑ θα έπρεπε να είναι πιο δυνατά δίπλα στην Ελλάδα το επόμενο διάστημα?
The United States is going to be the best and strongest ally to every single member of its alliance networks. And here in Europe, we're talking specifically about Greece and Turkey and the difficulties that we have here. There is a raging debate about the future of U.S.-Turkey relations. But remember that Turkey has been with Greece a member of the NATO alliance for 70 years. There are institutional relationships in the Pentagon, in the State Department, in the intelligence community, across the board between the two governments. And I think our goal largely, Savas, is to persuade Erdogan and the Turkish government to make decisions that are not only good for the United States and for Greece, but good for the 80 million citizens of Turkey. We want Turkey to be a successful country, a thriving country, a secure country, a prosperous country, and a Turkey that is more European and Western oriented is the best neighbor Greece can have. And we need to be very careful that we don't take steps that inadvertently push Turkey away for punitive purposes that make Turkey a more dangerous neighbor for Greece. So the goal here is to bring all of the countries into a greater policy harmonization and to persuade countries to not act aggressively towards one another and to work to resolve their problems cooperatively.
Κύριε Συτιλίδη, πραγματικά ήταν μεγάλη τιμή και χαρά που σας φιλοξενήσαμε στην Ναυτεμπορική, στην τηλεόραση Ναυτεμπορικής. Θα θέλαμε και την επόμενη φορά που θα επισκεφτείτε την Ελλάδα να είμαστε και πάλι μαζί εδώ, να δούμε τις εξελίξεις στον κόσμο και στη γειτονιά μας και εύχομαι να είναι καλύτερα τα πράγματα την επόμενη φορά και για τις ΗΠΑ και για την Ελλάδα. Κυρίες και κύριοι, φτάσαμε για άλλη μια φορά στο τέλος της εκπομπής Γεωπολιτικά. Μέχρι την επόμενη εβδομάδα να είστε όλες και όλοι καλά. Γεια σας.